Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Let's Talk Headlines series. I'm your host Jay, and this is The Objective. I want to thank you for tuning in to Season 2, Episode 19 of the Let's Talk Headlines series. Before we get into the show today, which I find to be an important show, I want to remind you to visit www.politicalstorm.com. On politicalstorm.com, you will find some awesome content creators giving you conservative news and conservative viewpoints at your fingertips. Now, I actually contribute to Political Storm, so all of my podcasts, some of my previous articles, I haven't written an article in quite some time, but you can check out my older ones. They're all compiled on Political Storm. So support independent media. Visit politicalstorm.com. Check us out. Visit us on Facebook. We have a Facebook page as well. And if you haven't already, be sure to follow me on Instagram at The Objective Podcast. I always love dialoguing with new followers, regardless of what your views are. So I do appreciate all the support I've gotten thus far. Now, this episode, we're going to be speaking on two main topics. The first topic is going to have to do with the U.S. and Iran conflict, especially in light of what we've been seeing with the acts of hostility on behalf of Iran and U.S. Allies and the U.S. itself. So we'll be touching on that, including, what exactly these acts of aggression were and how President Trump has decided to deal with them. Following by that, the second segment will include discussion on H.R. 40, which is the Commission to Study and Develop Reparation Proposals for African Americans. So there was a hearing in the House Judiciary, and I want to touch on not only Coleman Hughes, depending on how much time we have. I definitely want to read a segment of an article from the National Review. The writer is Sahil Handa. Now, the reason I want to read this verbatim is because it's such a powerful article, and it really resonated with me, and I agree wholeheartedly with it. He really captures the essence of what took place at the House hearing. So without further ado, folks, we're going to start the show, segment 1, with the U.S. and Iran conflict. So the most recent act of hostility and aggression was the downing of a U.S. $100 million unmanned and unarmed drone. So it's important to know that Tehran is denying any involvement in this destruction of the U.S. drone. But what this is doing, it's adding to an already high tension with the United States of America. So prior to the downing of this drone, it is highly suspected that, and more evidence is actually coming to light, that Iran was behind the destruction of those two tankers, the Japanese Kokuka, Courageous, and the Norwegian Front Altair. Both Democrats and Republicans actually come together and they condemn Iran in unity and in unison. So obviously there is circumstantial evidence that Iran is behind this, although they deny it. And it doesn't help their cause when we have them previously stating that if they can't export their oil, then no one else can. It's pretty damning. So another aspect, and it kind of goes hand in hand with the whole Russian collusion, where these state actors were these lone wolf attacks. Whether these attacks are acts of government delinquency or lone attackers, it's something that needs to be clearly determined prior to engaging in retaliatory acts. Some of you may agree with that, some of you may not. Some of you may be thinking, well, in order for the U.S. to, retaliate, just make sure that the response is proportional. Now, as we know, this American drone worth $100 million, it was unmanned and it was unarmed. Okay, so there's no loss of human life. This does, however, affect U.S. assets. It does affect, it is property of the United States military. So you destroy that, that isn't an act of an aggression. We're going to talk about, what should be done, what was going to be done, and most of you may know about that, and then what actually was done, which I think most people find to be reasonable and in line with American values and standards. So furthermore, to the point that this does lead to it kind of does point to Iran. Um, the MO, the modus operandi of this attack on the two tankers, and there have been previous attacks on tankers carrying oil, but the MO is consistent with that of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. I checked out the IRGC on Wikipedia, and I got some points here I want to share with you guys. So the IRGC, it's a branch of Iran's armed forces. It was founded in May 1979 after the Iranian Revolution. They are roughly 125,000 strong. They have land, air, and naval capabilities. Their main role, according to Iran, is national security. So they conduct asymmetric warfare, intelligence, law enforcement, border security operations. They have a special forces teams, resistance operations. So their objectives are parallel but separate from the traditional army. IRGC is considered a terrorist organization by the United States of America, as well as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. On April 15, 2019, the United States of America designated the IRGC a terrorist organization, although opposed by some in the CIA and the Pentagon. This designation was praised by Israel's leadership. Iran, the following day, to give you some context here, responded to this designation by naming the United States Central Command, which operates in and around the Middle East, a terrorist group. Now, this is important here, folks. The Iranian members of parliament dressed in green military pants in overt support for the IRGC, and they chanted "Death to America." Now, I don't know about you folks, but that chant by members of parliament in Iran, chanting "Death of America," that designation seems to be justified. So as we know, President Trump has been utilizing a maximum pressure tactic on Iran to hopefully have some positive outcomes and to deter further acts of aggression towards the United States. So these sanctions are crumbling the Iranian economy. And the thing is, when you back a hungry dog or a vicious creature or a vicious entity against the wall, when you pull them against the wall and they don't have many options, typically that what could be potentially a motive for these acts of aggression is the fact that they are backed against the wall. They don't really have any other recourse. In an article by Natasha Turek on CNBC.com, she states Iranian leaders have often threatened that if they can't export their oil, neither will anyone else. And last week, suspected attacks took place near the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway for 30% of the world's seaborne oil traffic. Actually, China is believed to be transporting about 62% of their oil goes through those straits. Continuing with Natasha Turek, her article on CNBC, she says here, combined with 4 tankers allegedly sabotaged off the United Arab Emirates coast of Fujairah on May 12, last week's attacks appear to be part of a systematic Iranian effort to demonstrate that peace and security in the Gulf is contingent on its own economic stability. So what she's saying is that, these 2 tanker attacks in concert with 4 previous tanker attacks, it's showing that the stance that Iran is taking, they're trying to demonstrate that peace and security in the Gulf is contingent on their own economic stability. So if they are being sanctioned, they can't transport their oil in peace, and they're being restricted, then no one else can. And that's why, circumstantially, this kind of systematic approach, this kind of pattern that we see going on circumstantially points to Iran being responsible and the only ones with a motive to be responsible for these sorts of attacks. So President Trump's response to the aggression, his goal is one that is proportional. Let's remember, I'll remind you again, the drone that was shot down, the American drone, was unmanned, it was unarmed, it just has a big price tag on it, $100 million, more than any of us will see. So his goal, as we know, allegedly there were 3 targets that were being prepared to be hit until Trump actually rescinded the order 10 minutes to the engagement. So I want to read some of these tweets here. On June 21st, Donald Trump tweeted, President Obama made a desperate and terrible deal with Iran, gave them $150 billion plus $1.8 billion in cash. Iran was in big trouble and he bailed them out, gave them a free path to nuclear weapons, and soon, instead of saying thank you, Iran yelled death to America, like I previously stated at the members of parliament. Continuing here with the tweet, I terminated the deal, which was not even ratified by Congress, and imposing strong sanctions. They are a much weakened nation today than at the beginning of my presidency when they were causing major problems throughout the Middle East. Now they are bust. On Monday, they shot down an unmanned drone flying in international waters. We were cocked and loaded to retaliate last night on 3 different sites. When I asked how many will die, 150 people, sir, was the answer from the general. 10 minutes before the strike, I stopped it, not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone. I'm in no hurry, or our military is rebuilt, new and ready to go, by far the best in the world. Sanctions are biting, and more added last night. Iran can never have nuclear weapons, not against the USA and not against the world. Now, folks, regardless of what you think of the president of the United States, this was a measured response. This was a judicious response. And this was a proportional response, reminding us again that this was just an unmanned drone, 150 in collateral, 150 human lives in collateral for $100 million drone. It doesn't quite equal up. The price of a human life, there is no price, not even $100 million. So 150 human lives, potentially innocent people who have no part in the decisions that were made regarding the destruction of the tankers or the shooting down of the drone. It's just not proportional. It does not fall in line with American values and just war. And critics have been stating, rightfully so, that if Trump doesn't retaliate in some form, then this is sending a message of weakness to Iran. Now that could be true. There are some people, there's some nations who need to see strength in order to gain their respect. And to know that you're not playing around. So as of June 24, 2019, Trump has signed an executive order issuing new sanctions on Iran. So we're seeing this is not a military response. Instead, he is tightening the grip of these sanctions that he already has in place. So these sanctions include denying the supreme leader and those associated to him access to key financial resources and support. The Treasury Department, this is from Fox News, in a news release said any foreign financial institution that knowingly facilitates a significant financial transaction for entities designated under this executive order could be cut off from the U.S. financial system. Now, no one wants to be cut off from the United States financial system. It's the biggest and the greatest in the world. You want to have a stake in that system. And these are quotes. This is a quote here from President Trump or just before he signed the executive order. He says he will continue to increase pressure on Tehran until the regime abandons its dangerous activities and aspirations, including the pursuit of nuclear weapons, increasing enrichment of uranium, development of ballistic missiles, engagement and support for terrorism, fueling of foreign conflicts, and belligerent acts directed against the United States and its allies. And he continued to say, remember in his tweet, he said, never can Iran have nuclear weapons. Now, this is a strong position. This is a position that is needed. He is saying, I'm not taking any of the nonsense. This is what needs to change, and then we will release the sanctions. He is making a very firm point, and the ball is completely in Iran's court. But anyways, guys, we're going to cut into a break right now. The second segment, I just want to read something to you guys. We're going to cut to break. Thank you guys so much for your support thus far. Stick around. We're almost done the show. We'll be back in a moment.
If we were to pay reparations today, we would only divide the country further, making it harder to build the political coalitions required to solve the problems facing Black people today. We would insult many Black Americans by putting a price on the suffering of their ancestors. And we would turn the relationship between Black Americans and white Americans from a coalition into a transaction, from a union between citizens into a lawsuit between plaintiffs and defendants. What we should do is pay reparations to Black Americans who actually grew up under Jim Crow and were directly harmed by second-class citizenship, people like my grandparents. But paying reparations to all descendants of slaves is a mistake. Take me, for example. I was born 3 decades after the end of Jim Crow into a privileged household in the suburbs. I attend an Ivy League school. Yet I'm also descended from slaves who worked on Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation. So reparations for slavery would allocate federal resources to me, but not to an American with the wrong ancestry, even if that person is living paycheck to paycheck and working multiple jobs to support a family. You might call that justice. I call it justice for the dead at the price of justice for the living. I understand that reparations are about what people are owed, regardless of how well they're doing. I understand that. But the people who are owed for slavery are no longer here, and we're not entitled to collect on their debts. Reparations, by definition, are only given to victims. So the moment you give me reparations, you've made me into a victim without my consent.
Welcome back, everyone, to the second segment of the Let's Talk Headlines show. I'm your host, Jay, and this is The Objective. I want to thank you for sticking around for the second segment. You just heard from Coleman Hughes, at least part of his about 5-minute testimony, witness testimony to the House Judiciary. I recommend that you take a look and listen at the entire, hearing. I think it was good to hear everyone's point of view, especially Coleman Hughes. I think he was very well spoken, had some great points. Now, so as we're saying, on June 20th, 2019, a number of witnesses testified before the House Judiciary Committee on the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. The testimony that stole the show, for me at least, was that of Coleman Hughes. Coleman Hughes is a rare specimen to me. He is not a traditional liberal. He is more of a classical one, with eloquent abandon and a very collected demeanor. He gracefully dismantled the argument for reparations. And obviously, in regular fashion, he was met with boos and moans from the crowd. The usual response when a suitable counter-argument cannot be articulated. So there's an article, like I said at the beginning of the show, from Sahil Handa. That article is on the National Review. And I want to read this article verbatim to you, and we are going to end the show on that. It's not a long one, but it's a powerful one. Picture the scene. A young man walks into a congressional hearing to offer witness testimony. His grandfather was barbarically brutalized by people who are now long dead. The nation in which he resides built its wealth off his grandfather's brutalization. The question: should his fellow citizens pay the young man his overdue inheritance? He begins his speech by honoring his grandfather's suffering. Nothing he will say is intended to lift the responsibility from those who caused it, but he goes on to say that he does not believe he should collect on his grandfather's debts because he does not want justice for the dead at the price of the living. He sees millions of people in his country struggling to afford the means to survive, and others' lives being wasted as they languish in prison cells. He sees citizens shooting each other on the streets as police numbers dwindle, the schools too poor to offer their students the chance to succeed. These injustices, he argues, are more pressing than his own grievances. He comes from a privileged household in the suburbs and attends an Ivy League school. Many of those who would be forced to pay him deserve his compassion, not his financial demand. The congressional hearing occurred on Tuesday, June 20, 2019. What I did not mention was that the young man happened to be black, and that he did not only speak on his behalf, but on behalf of the estimated 15 million black Americans who share his view. His name was Coleman Hughes, and he argued that his country should not pay reparations for slavery, that debts should be paid to those who were once affected by Jim Crow, but not to those who've suffered no harm. For this, he was booed, but he persisted through the taunts. He has since been labeled a traitor, an Uncle Tom, and a coon. Ta-Nehisi Coates was one of those asked to testify for the opposing view. The accomplished writer contended that reparations are the only way that the United States can come to terms with its strained history. Every one of its institutions stole from the African American community. The nation's financial accounts are not bound by generations, but by a collective enterprise. If a person has benefited from Americans' shores, he has a duty to help the descendants of those who exploitation created them. Reparations are tantamount to a thief returning his stolen goods. Coates' testimony was treated with a round of applause in the room. He has since been hailed as a courageous hero who dared speak truth to power. The people who have not praised Coates included those who are currently homeless, starving, incarcerated, or uneducated, because even if they received reparations, those facts would remain the same. When he stepped into the room, Coleman Hughes knew what he was doing. He knew that many members of his country would accuse him of defending white supremacy, and that he would leave the room with fewer friends and numerous life opportunities closed. But he delivered his testimony because he was asked to state what he believed. He delivered his testimony because he did not want millions to be turned into victims and perpetrators without their consent. One can debate the merits of the arguments for and against reparations. One can label them impractical, immoral, previously paid, or pressingly necessary. But one must never debate whether a person's skin color ought to determine his view, because nothing, I repeat, nothing, could be more disgustingly racist. Thanks for tuning into the 19th episode of Let's Talk Headlines. Until we see each other again, make it your goal to be objective. Have a good night.